Hi everyone, and thank you for taking time to listen to this episode. I'm not even sure if it should really be called an episode since it's not on track for what the podcast is meant to do, which is help you as a tax professional to progress, develop and improve your career in some way. But as you'll see from the title of this episode, I'm basically taking a bit of a mini break from releasing episodes in the podcast, and I suppose I want to tell you why I've got to this point and why I'm going to take a bit of a break. I'll tell you about when I'm going to come back, or when I plan to come back anyway, and start releasing more episodes. A bit about the future of the podcast and just a few other things as well. So I'll just give you kind of a full general update and not just disappear for a few months without you knowing what's happening.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals Podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
So I suppose the main reason that I'm deciding to take a bit of a break is one word: stress, which might sound a bit ridiculous because why would the podcast cause me stress? And it's not the podcast in particular that causes stress, but it's one of the contributors for me at the moment for me feeling that way, I think. And I suppose really it boils down to me taking on or trying to do too much at once. So I put myself under pressure to release episodes every 2 weeks on Mondays, and it means I never really get to take a break from that. I also work as a tax advisor 4 days a week. I don't just do the podcast, I do like training and other things, and I want time to do things and relate to the podcast that aren't just releasing episodes. So for example, I want to help the podcast to grow. I want to make it better. And when I'm kind of stuck in the hamster wheel of churning out episodes every 2 weeks, I don't really have much time left to do that, because each episode takes at least usually 5 hours to make from start to finish. That's not even including organising and finding guests. So, an episode itself, I have to plan it, I have to record it, I have to edit it. And I suppose at that point it could go live, but because I want people to listen to the episodes, I want to advertise and do all those other things, I have to do things like write the emails that notify you of the episodes. I have to write LinkedIn posts. I have to write show notes so that people can find the podcast when they, type on Google and all those type of things. So it takes about 5 hours per episode. When I started the podcast, I was spending about 5 hours a week on the podcast. When I went down to 4 days a week as a tax advisor, I started spending about 12 hours 15 a week on the podcast. So that gives quite a lot more time. But when I start doing all these other things, like want to make the podcast better, get better at telling stories, to be more interesting on the episodes, find good guests, make sure that there's good titles of the episode so that it sounds interesting and that the episode actually delivers on what the title says and all those type of things, there really isn't that much time left. And I suppose in some ways, I don't want to have the pressure of having to do work on an episode when I'm really not in the mood for it, which has happened, I suppose, quite a lot recently, where, I've come home from work after a long day. I know that an episode needs to be released. I don't need to prep for it. I don't need to edit it. And I force myself to do it because I know I need to do that to get the episode out. And I suppose that's taken a bit of the enjoyment away from the podcast. I mean, don't get me wrong, I do enjoy doing it, but I think because I've released an episode every other week for 4 years straight, it's become a little bit relentless. I don't want to feel like that way about it. I really enjoy the podcast. It's been a really great experience for me. I like being able to help you all who listen, and it's really nice when I get all the nice messages and everything, but I just need to take the little bit of a break just so that I can come back feeling more refreshed, more energized to do it, and I suppose not become burnt out by doing the podcast, which I know some of this stuff might sound ridiculous, even more so now I'm saying it out loud and it's not just me thinking it in my head, but thought I'll just tell you these things for complete, transparency, I suppose, and so that you know. So one of the last reasons as to why as well I decided to take a break is this year new listeners and listeners of each episode it's stagnated a bit, and you might have seen from some of my LinkedIn posts, you might have heard on some of the episodes that I've done, that my aim this year was actually to try and get to 1,000 listeners on each episode within essentially the first 90 days. And I can see already that I'm not even going to be close to hitting that if I just keep churning out podcast episodes every 2 weeks and don't have time to, advertise it, maybe market it, get it in front of more people, all those type of things. So when will I return then with the podcast? So the plan as of right now is to take basically a 2-month break. So apart from the episode that's already been released in July, there'll be no more episodes released in July. There'll be no more episodes released in August. And the next episode will be released, as per my plan anyway, on the 2nd of September this year. So the 2nd of September 2024. And as always, it's going to be a Monday. And apart from knowing that that's when I'm going to release or at least that's when I plan to release my next episode, I don't know exactly what the future of the podcast looks like yet. So I need to make sure that it fits into my working life, my personal life and everything, and doesn't, I suppose, lead me to having this feeling of stress and getting close to burnout with the podcast. So I might do episodes every 2 weeks like I have done for the past 4 years. I might do that, but just take more regular breaks. So, for example, maybe I'll take a break over Christmas or over summer holidays so I get a bit of time back. Or maybe it'll be more sporadic than that. I could also just release episodes less frequently, say every 3 weeks rather than every 2 weeks. I really don't know at this point. I mean, I think where I'm probably going to go is episodes every 2 weeks still on Mondays with more frequent breaks, maybe 2 or so a year where I take so many breaks just so I don't, I suppose, get to this position where I just feel like I'm churning out podcast episodes and force myself to do it when it's not enjoyable for me to do. But when I do return, I've got loads of episodes already planned actually, so I want to give you a bit of a flavour for the type of things you can expect to hear when I start releasing episodes again. So one I just recorded this week, which to be honest I think is a really good episode. It's with someone called Stephen Hodson, who's already been on the podcast before, and he's a in-house indirect tax person, and he's head of indirect tax at a business called Entei, and he's got a pretty big indirect tax team for an in-house team anyway. So in that episode we talk about like what an in-house tax team wants and values from external advisors. So I suppose part of the reason I did this episode is because I was keen myself to see whether I can take advantage of, I suppose, knowing a lot of tax professionals that work in-house and support them in some way as kind of a BD and a work stream for me as a tax advisor, particularly in my new role as a director. So I was keen to explore that. So I really wanted to ask him like what he finds valuable, what he wants from them, what he doesn't want from external advisors, so that I could, I suppose, model myself to do that better and be more wanted and have in-house tax teams want to work with me more. And also you all get the benefit of knowing what that looks like too from that conversation. You might remember an episode I did probably about a year ago now. It was with someone called Ellie Theochari, who was recently promoted to tax partner, or recently got a tax partner role anyway when I spoke to her last. And she got that at 29 years old, which is quite an accomplishment. And so she's coming up to a year of having her tax partner role now. And so we're going to do an episode where we try to reflect on how it's gone for her so we can get an insight for how her first year as a tax partner has been. So she can give us an insight into that. Got a massive list here, so I'm just going to keep going through them. So these are all planned and in the pipeline. So at some point they will come out, as long as, I suppose, a guest doesn't change their mind. But I've got an episode that's going to be on ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution, which is when there's an inquiry by HMRC into a taxpayer, and it's a way of hopefully resolving disputes. So I went through a process myself of ADR for a client about 6 months ago now and was really disappointed by the outcome for that. And so I wanted to speak to someone who is, I suppose, more of an expert in ADR, get their views, get their thoughts, what it's about, how it works, when it's beneficial to use for clients, etc., so that you know when to go down that route or when to consider that route for your own clients. I might do an episode where I kind of update on how my role as a tax director is going, just to give you a bit of an update of what's happened so far, what the role's looking like, what type of things I'm doing, that type of thing really. Just, I suppose, to give a flavour and an insight into the start of a role as a tax director for the first time. That's something I think I would have found useful before I went into the role. Also want to do an episode, hopefully, the skills that accountancy firms value in tax professionals. And I'll be doing that with ProTax, who sponsored the podcast over the past 3 months, so you've probably heard about them a few times now. And so I was keen to do an episode with a recruiter that wasn't like recruitery, that wasn't salesy, that wasn't just trying to place people and get people to move roles. And so that's the topic we settled on. And I think it'll be quite a good one because they know exactly what the accountancy firms are saying to them in terms of what they want, feedback from interviews and all those other things. So they'll have a really good idea of the skills that accountancy firms value. They'll be able to share that with us. So the last 2 episodes that are in the pipeline that's worth mentioning is I'm going to do an episode, as long as the guest doesn't cancel anyway, on COP 9, Code of Practice 9. So that is where there is a HMRC inquiry into someone that they believe has committed tax fraud in some way. And I've always thought it sounds really interesting, the whole concept of COP 9, but I don't really know much about it. So that guest will share with us what that is, about it, when it's relevant, and just, I suppose, give us some interesting stories that they've dealt with over the years, hopefully. And then the last one is not a tax person at all, and it's not even going to be, I suppose, specific for tax professionals really, but I've got recommended someone called Estelle Reed, who is a coach and an expert on imposter syndrome. And when I was told about her, I was told that she kind of advocates or says there is 5 different types of imposter syndrome, I think it is. And, you know, how it manifests itself, what it does, how you can solve it to, I suppose, do better in your career. And when the person was telling me about the 5 different imposter syndromes, I was like, I think I meet one of those, maybe even 2 of them. And I would never have, I suppose, even considered labelling it as imposter syndrome before. So I think that one will be interesting. It will hopefully help anyone who has any of those signs of imposter syndrome, I suppose, to deal with it and to... or even utilise it for the benefit of their career. They're upcoming episodes that are in the pipeline. As I say, you know, there is chances that guests will change their minds. It doesn't really happen, but just think, I just want to caveat, so in case, you know, some of these episodes don't end up actually becoming a reality. First, in the meantime then, between now and the 2nd of September, which is when I plan to release the next episode, I've listed what I think are some of the most interesting past episodes to go back and listen to if you haven't already, or maybe even if you listened to them before. So the first one is episode 61, which was one I did on 3 different ways to make money outside of your main tax job, which was a popular episode. I suppose in some ways I expected it to be popular because most people are interested in making a bit of money on the side, but that one was quite popular. Probably the most popular non-exam related episode I've ever done is episode 76, which was with someone called Charlie Friend. And that was all about how to take control of your tax career. And Charlie's just a fabulous job at that. She was a PwC manager, I believe, at a very young age, something like, I don't know, I'm going to say 23 or 24, which I suppose really is unheard of. You don't see many people at manager at that age. And that was kudos to her for taking control of her career. So that was a really popular episode and definitely a super useful one to listen to if you're interested in progressing and developing your own career. Got episode 88, so I mentioned Ellie Theochari in terms of one of the future episodes coming out. So the episode I did with her previously was a popular one, and it was, I suppose, it was a tax career success secrets episode, and we talked a bit about her becoming tax partner at 29 years old. So that's a good episode to go back and listen to. Very conversational. Ellie is, you know, just, I suppose, a fascinating person in some ways. She's done so well in her career, so young. So she's a really good person to listen to if you're interested in doing something similar. Also going to suggest listening to episode 98, which is why I moved tax roles after 7 years at my previous firm. That one has been a fairly popular one too, and some people have told me that I've said some things that I probably shouldn't say or that they wouldn't say, but I just wanted to be as honest and open as possible. We have the whole umbrella of all the episodes that are there to help people pass their CTA exams in some way. So if you go onto my website and you go into the podcast tab, you'll be able to select like a subcategory of the CTA and ATT episodes. That covers the CBEs. It covers episodes related to passing ATT and CTA exams. So if you're in a situation now where you're sitting CTA or ATT, you can go listen to them. Or if you're someone that knows people that are doing that, you can always point them in that direction. So most listeners, I suppose this isn't particularly surprising, most listeners of the podcast, I think, come from episodes that I've done for CTA or ATT exams. They're the most popular episodes by far. But I suppose the difficulty or the challenge that I have is it'll be great in some ways to do loads of those episodes because it would bring in new listeners quite easily. But there's a lot of you now that listen that are qualified because you might have came on board with the podcast early on when I started doing it, and now you're qualified. And so I think the main bulk of you who listen regularly are already CTA qualified and don't need help with passing exams anymore. So those episodes are not going to be particularly interesting or helpful to you. I know some people have told me that they're helpful in that it lets them stay in the loop of what their trainees are going through and so that they can help their trainees and all those type of things. But I just know they're not going to be the most relevant or targeted episodes for people who are qualified anymore. So you might have noticed over like the past 6 months or so, I haven't done as many exam-based episodes as what I did before that. And that was, well, it was a choice. I wanted to make sure that I could release episodes that were, I suppose, more relevant, more helpful for people who aren't in that stage of their career anymore, because I think those of you who do listen regularly are not in that position anymore. So I think that pretty much covers everything then that I wanted to update you on in this episode. We'll still be around and active, particularly on LinkedIn. You can still email me, you can still contact me. I literally am just taking a break from releasing podcast episodes themselves for 2 months. I'm still working on the podcast and related things in the meantime. So, I think a lot of my time is going to be spent on becoming better at storytelling. I think it's also going to be spent on figuring out and implementing strategies to get in front of new listeners and retain current listeners as well. So it's not that I'm taking a complete break from the podcast. It literally is just a break from releasing podcast episodes. So hopefully you found that interesting anyway. Hopefully it wasn't too long. I'm looking at the clock now and I can see that I've been talking for almost 20 minutes, which actually is quite a long time when I'm just telling you that I'm taking a break. But that's where we're at anyway. So this is the last you'll hear from me on the podcast until at least the 2nd of September this year. And in the meantime, if you do want to contact me or anything, please do. And if I can just ask for one favour of everyone, is if you found the podcast useful in any way, shape or form over the past 4 years, it would be really appreciated if you could go on to Apple Podcasts, if you have access to it, and leave a review and a rating on there for me, because that's going to help bring in more listeners for when I come back to doing the podcast. And if you don't use Apple Podcasts, you probably use Spotify. If you can go on Spotify and just leave a star rating on there for me as well, that would be really useful. So both of those things are just going to make it. I suppose doing that's going to help me see the amount of people out there that appreciate and get value from the podcast. And it's also going to help to bring in new listeners for when I start publishing episodes live again. So thank you everyone for listening. I hope you found that at least a bit insightful and hopefully not boring. But here we are, and I will speak to you on here again in about 2 months' time. Thanks everyone.